Welcome to our Danos Pathways to Success video series. This series of interviews have been crafted to help you learn how to approach your career. I'm Valerie Phillips. I head legal recruitment for our US offices. With me is a friend and classmate, Michael Pastor.
Hello.
Hi. Mike, in addition to being an old friend, is the director of the James Tricarico Jr. Institute for the Business of Law and In-House Counsel at New York Law School. He's also an adjunct professor at New York Law School. And briefly, I'm going to recite a little bit of the background of his career to contextualize the conversation we'll have today. Prior to heading into academia at New York Law School, Mike served as the General Counsel of DoITT, the New York City Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications. He also served as General Counsel for New York City's Cyber Command and Deputy Commissioner of Legal Affairs and Franchises for DoITT as well. Prior to that, he spent roughly a decade at the New York City Law Department as Senior Counsel for two different divisions. Thank you. It's been a while. And prior to that, Mike was in private practice as a litigation associate at Morrison & Foerster. At the very beginning of his career, following law school graduation, he served as a federal district court clerk. And so he's really worn quite a few different hats: public sector, private practice, then various agency roles, and now academia. And I think a lot of that will inform how he shares details with us about career transitions and progressions. So I think my first question to you, Mike, today, rather than talking at the screen, is talking to you. I'd love to hear you talk about your own pathway and the degree to which you feel that you were the architect of your own fate professionally, and the degree to which you really feel that you bent to market forces in play that you couldn't have anticipated.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Valerie. It's great to be here with someone I've known for many, many decades and friends with for many decades, and excited to be talking to you and to the listeners. To take your first question, I think what I would say is my path has been a mix of me being the architect of it, but then also just having been the beneficiary of great fortune. And so for me, it's been a combination of my own efforts and fortune, less so market power. And I think the reason, or market forces, I should say.
Fair enough.
And I think the reason for that is after working at Morrison & Foerster for some time in big firm life, I decided to go into government work, which I recommend to all. Government work is less about sort of market forces at play and more about the initiatives of the elected officials and different levels of government that you work at. And so that pivot there from Morrison & Foerster to government work, I mean, I was the architect of that. But at each step along the way, you're fortunate if you have very good mentors and very good people, training you and sponsoring you. The word I like to use is sponsor. It's not like a sponsorship on TV. It's someone who's actually actively backing your career. And I've been the beneficiary of incredible sponsors, going back to the judge that I clerked for in the District of Maryland. Judge Williams, who just had an immense impact on my career and was a sponsor of me from the minute I walked into chambers. And so I think, yes, I think you have to, I have pursued things along the way in terms of things that I wanted to do. And so for in my particular case, market did not play a lot. I will say though, since you raised that topic, I work at New York Law School with a number of students and a number of alums. And for them, for the alums that I speak to, market forces actually often play a huge role in terms of the timing of when they graduate, in terms of the timing of when they want to move. And obviously we are having market convulsions as it relates to the pandemic. And I think that will be hugely impactful for people's careers and for, the paths that they take.
Sure. Some practices of law are cyclical and episodic. Some are very steady, and whenever you have a market disrupting event, it changes things. And so I think knowing how to be flexible is useful, but also taking the lessons of whatever you've experienced and observed, being guided by that and being nimble and agile as you pivot towards the future. So I guess my question to you, my next question to you would be, given that you've had time in private practice and as a clerk and in government and academia, how do those various hats that you've worn inform one another as you think about the practice of law?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like every position for a lawyer or for JD, for persons working in compliance, risk management, you name it. Whether you acknowledge it or not, I mean, they all operate at the interaction in a way of government and the private sector and academia, in terms of, scholars are working on all different types of issues that informs the way we approach issues from a legal perspective. They inform the way judges approach those issues from the judicial perspective. And, for most people, let's say in-house, for example, I'm running an institute focused on in-house now. Almost every single in-house position will have touch points with regulation in one way or the other. What that might be, regulations that are in place, that might be regulators that are sort of actively overseeing industry, that might be, attorneys or JDs who work in government affairs positions thinking about how to mold regulations. So I think that I do suggest to people beginning their career, and I'm sure there are people listening who are either beginning or far along.
Or considering a pivot.
Considering a pivot, that's right. I mean, I do think that, what I'll say from my own experience is that trying new things, being open to trying new things, and gaining that experience, whatever it is, is worth it. And to start with one example, I started at Morrison & Foerster, an incredible firm that has a huge tech practice and a huge cyber practice right now. And when I started at Morrison & Foerster, I was WePup, and I was in litigation working on huge cases. But I was there for 2.5, 3 years. Really feel like it was a good thing for me at that time to experience big firm life, to work on huge cases, to get trained by some exceptional attorneys. And then I knew at that time, after a couple of years, government was my calling, and I made a switch to that. And I've always sort of thought in my mind, I do want to teach as well and work with students, and that's what I'm doing now. So it's about, I mean, I can't stress enough. It's about saying yes to opportunities that come along. And I do think that, we are in an age now where, multiple experiences will benefit you. I feel like it may not be the case, but I feel like traditionally decades ago, people would get in a role, they'd stay in a role, and that's perfectly fine if people want to do that now. But I think in the environment where now, it's good for people to have tried a bunch of things.
Oh yeah, and I think the market's more receptive to that. I mean, maybe I like the sound of my own voice because I'm a recruiter, but I'll tell you that I use the metaphor of 30 years in a gold watch. Now the watch isn't gold anymore; it's a Fitbit, and 30 years in one role is just sort of anathema to people coming out of school right now. The reality is that most of the clients and businesses that I deal with really appreciate perspectives guiding you, and there's no expectation that you're going to be in one space, staying in your lane the whole time. With that in mind, I'd love it if you shared, because I expect some of our listeners don't know too much about the Institute, a little bit about its focus and its goals, because to the degree it's an unknown quantity, it'd be great if you could educate folks.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. So the Tricarico Institute for the Business of Law and In-House Counsel was founded at New York Law School just over a year ago. And I became the director of the Institute shortly after that. And the Institute has sort of two main objectives. The first is we are preparing a comprehensive curriculum for the students at New York Law School who may want to go in-house, and it's about preparing them for success in-house. So that's going to be new curriculum, it's going to be programming, it's going to be externship and internship support, and it's going to be engaging with the extensive New York Law School alumni community to work with them. And I think it's fair to say, and I know for me at least, when I was in law school, that type of institute did not exist. They might be out there at other law schools, and that would be great, but we really think we're filling a void there. For students who think to themselves, I want to go in-house, well, we want to prepare them for that, and that's preparing them from the day they get in the door of New York Law School and try back to the minute they graduate. The other thing we're trying to do is to create a thought leadership center for the community writ large. So there are people out there in New York City, in the tri-state area, around the country, around the world, who work in-house. And our thesis is that they need more places to go to engage with other people in that community, to talk about ideas, to exchange best practices, to talk about what they're seeing in their practices. And so that's what we're doing. To give one example of how those things combine, Last fall, we hosted the first Tribeca Cybersecurity Summit. It was a 2-day event at the law school with leading practitioners in cyber, both from a lawyer and a technologist perspective, coming together to talk with our audience about what they're seeing and what they're doing. You can see how that fits into the 2 objectives of the Institute, right?
For sure.
Students attended and can learn about what cybersecurity is and what it means, but we also had a number of people come, from the in-house community writ large to hear about that as well. So that's what we're doing. I never want to forget to mention that the sort of third objective of the Tricarico Institute is a focus on diversity and equity and inclusion. That's core to our mission and it's core to what we do. So yes, we are doing those first 2 things for students and for the in-house community writ large, but we have our eye on justice and equity as well. And those objectives frame our programming as well.
No, I think you need to have partners moving the needle and people leading by example. So it's great to hear about that, and certainly aligned with what we at Danos try to do. Briefly, you spoke about cybersecurity. I know that you mentioned it was something, it's certainly not all of what the Tricarico Institute does, but it informs some of the work, and you're informed by it, having worn the hat of somebody dealing with incident response and preparation. So given that it's a growing area, something I heard recently in one of my own searches, I was speaking with a lot of attorney candidates trying to source for a role that was very security focused. And I spoke with a lot of people doing data privacy. And I feel like those 2 threads, they touch, but then they diverge in places. I'm curious what your observation is in the cybersecurity world about the interplay between security law on the one hand and data privacy on the other.
Absolutely. So the touch points between those 2 fields are nearly never ending in a way. And what I would say about them is, let me start with security. So I was the general counsel for the New York City Cyber Command. So we were focused on, securing not just the data, right, that it was held by the city, but also the city systems and its networks to allow the city to function, right? So I think from that perspective, cybersecurity has its eye on the operations of an organization. Can our organization continue to operate? Can our organization remain secure from threats? And then the lawyer's role in that is sort of like, how can I assist the CISO and the other folks working on the technology side? How can I assist them in maintaining the cybersecurity program for the organization? So it is focused a lot on the operations of the organization. Privacy has a sort of different root from, in my opinion. It has a root in what I would call a rights-based focus, right? Which you don't hear about a lot in cybersecurity. And so it's sort of focused on, the protection of data from a rights perspective, from what it will mean to the individual if their data is misused, stolen, and that can be misused by the organization itself or by someone who steals it.
Right.
And so I think those are the sort of the differences. But what I will say is kind of these are sort of 2 rivers that sort of flow in and out. And to that point, I would add that I started by saying cybersecurity is about operations. So you might draw from that, well, that doesn't have a human component. But the truth of the matter is that if a cyber attack is successful, it can very frequently have a significant human impact. I'll give you an example. Hospital systems, whether in COVID or not, hospital systems have cybersecurity programs, they have cybersecurity controls.
And with telehealth, I'm sure all the more complicated than it was.
All the more. Yes, so there's collection of data. So thinking about kind of keeping it private and protecting it.
Storage of data.
And all that, but there's also sort of the human element of the cybersecurity exercise. And that's actually why I think it's such an appealing career choice for those interested. I feel like people like to go to work and do something that makes them feel fulfilled and makes them feel that they're leaving a mark on the world.
Adding value.
Adding value, absolutely. And so if you are an attorney, operating in privacy, risk, compliance, cyber, all of those things sound kind of dry and technical, but have a real profound impact, or they have a profound impact if they're not done well. And so that's why I think for people wondering, would I pivot to cyber? Would I pivot to privacy?
What would that look like?
That might be why you'd want to do it.
Yeah, and I know you can't speak to specific incidents, nor would I ask you to, but just generally, I assume that a lot of what we learn in terms of proactive steps we might wish to take isn't just a matter of reading and interpreting regulations, but responding to actual breaches. So I'm curious, in terms of what you've done and speaking with other GCs and other agency heads, how do we learn and how does responding to breaches inform our approach to all things cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think what I would say about that, Valerie, is let me take it from the viewpoint of a lawyer, since that's what I am and what I was. I mean, I think what I learned as the General Counsel of the New York City Cyber Command is that there are certain things that lawyers do when they're doing their job well that I think apply in any practice, and they certainly apply in incident prep and incident response.
Sure.
So what does that mean? So if you're preparing your incident response plan, well, lawyers, will come at that and look at, what does the language of that plan say? Who's involved? Who's responsible for what? This is something that in-house lawyers think about all the time and do well for non-cyber things, is what I'm trying to explain. And then I would say that within the confines of incidents, potential breaches, and then investigations that follow, I think that, lawyers are meant to be the steady hand. They're meant to, ask questions. What do we learn in law school? Like, we are asked questions and issue spot, ask questions, and try to find out the facts, get to the bottom of things. And so I think that's another, key component of incident response. It's being a steady hand, asking questions, and learning the trade. And I think the third thing I will say, again, I'm not revealing anything at all about my own particular practice, but quality in-house work depends on relationship building. And that is, it could not be more true for cyber. It means building the relationship with the CISO, with the CISO's team, with the other technology people, with the infrastructure people from day one. And getting to know
with the engineers, I'm sure, not just the legal and the business, but also the folks who are in the guts of the devices that track and scrape information.
Absolutely. And it's about, building that relationship, getting on a first name basis. I mean, some of these things, they sound so cliche, but it's like in that moment, you want to get on the phone and be like, hi, so-and-so, we've spoken 10 times already. I've gotten to know you and I've gotten to know your team and what you do. You've gotten to know me and my team. So when I have other people on the call, you recognize them. All of that human relationship building is fundamental. And why is it fundamental in cyber, as it is in, for many in-house things, is that cyber involves stress. Sure, not just human stress on the organization, stress on the team. The relationships are that the sort of fabric that withstand those stress points. And if they're not there, there's a rupture, and you're not going to be where you want to be.
Right. No, I think it's something that I don't remember law school speaking to enough. Not to fault my or your law school. I don't think we had that framework or that lens through which to look at things X number of decades ago. But the reality is that it's not just issue spotting, it's being able to apply it. I mean, I guess if I were to analogize to physical security, I've seen a lot of people talking in the last week as I do scroll through Twitter about responding to one guy with a shoot bomb once. And the problem is that sometimes you prepare for a response to a threat you've seen, but you don't know how to respond to the next threat that's coming. So if you look at it, I mean, maybe there are only so many ways to breach data systems, but you have to think, what will a creative hacker do the next time? What should I be ready for that I don't know what it looks like? Fair enough. And working with people who know more about the guts of computers and know more about the guts of systems and processes than you do as a lawyer, you're able to put that together and have a plan that will make it less likely that any organization or institution you're responsible for will fall prey to some sort of threat or attack. Fair?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for me, that comes down to the notion of being nimble as an attorney, in the same way that technologists are nimble. I speak with colleagues frequently about this notion of sort of continuous improvement. What are you doing to better your practice? And I speak to the students at the Tricarico Institute about this all the time, and because they're in law school, it's about what are they doing to improve through law school and then after. And I think that one thing that comes to my mind there, just by way of specific example, as it relates to sort of thinking through the prior incidents and how that might inform, are what we call in the cyber world the tabletop exercise. So the tabletop exercise is something that I'm very fond of. It's about bringing people literally together around a table, remotely if it needs to be, or not, around the table, and you bring people around the table and you put them through an exercise about, a hypothetical exercise, which really resonates in the real world. And I think those exercises are superb at identifying, ways in which, you maybe need to adjust and you need to advance, for future attacks. And we'll go back to your question, though, Valerie, about how physical attacks, might inform a cyber, practice. I mean, one of the things that I think is not well known is that physical security and cybersecurity are related, highly related. And so there is that component too, meaning like how are our data centers, how is our data physically secure? Who has physical access to the data center?
Right. What about a guy or a gal with an electromagnet as opposed to somebody hacking in through a computer?
Absolutely, that's the real thing. Although a lot of, cyber attacks don't involve physical access, but it's certainly a component of it. But I do think that cyber professionals, and by that I mean the technical professionals, not the lawyers, absolutely study and keep their eye on things. And I would also say that there's also, there are government actors here. There's CISA at the federal level and others. They are, I think, constantly looking at what attacks look like. And one of the things that I'm a big supporter of, I was when I was in government, I am now in academia, is sort of extensive and solid engagement between, the government authorities and the public sector and the private sector to sort of all work together in tandem.
Yeah, well, one thing I always say is the only constant is change. There's shifting regulatory terrain, and that could be at the global level, dealing with information that transmits between one continent and another, the federal, the state, and the local. And with midterms not too far off on the horizon, I'm curious, how that informs the way you educate, the questions the students are asking, or the issues that they need to address as they mature into fully equipped private practitioners.
I think what I would say about that is, it's hard to say that this is the most volatile time ever. You never know what things were like in 1961 or some other year. But it certainly feels that way. And I think that when I speak to students about that, that comes down to preparation and the things that they're doing to be ready for the next generation threats and the next generation issues. I will say, to go back to a point I made about what I think of as an important key to in-house practice is, I mentioned steadiness as a concept that I think that, lawyers need to demonstrate. That's going to be true no matter what, no matter what, volatility, comes around the corner. I mean, I can tell you this, if you're an in-house counsel in January this year, how many of them were thinking, well, what if there's an invasion of Ukraine, and sort of how could that impact the world, and how could that impact our practice? 1 out of 1,000, maybe 0 out of 1,000. But that they've been through crises before, that they know to be steady, that they know to be rigorous in their legal approach, in their counsel. And one of the great things about being an in-house counsel is that there's a real classical element to it, that I think goes back centuries. In terms of, whether it's a monarch, back 500 years or whoever it is, the notion of sort of what does my counsel have to say about, and how can they help me? It's something that has a real classical component, and I think good counseling, maybe would have looked somewhat the same then, right?
Sure.
Getting to know the client, getting to know the client's objectives,
needs, concerns,
and knowing the regulatory landscape, whatever that would have looked like, 500 years ago. But so I think that's pretty much the same.
Yeah, it is interesting how that works. Speaking to my own experience, I was a litigator before becoming a recruiter, and the baptism by fire that I had, because I was at the New York City law. I remember having coffee with you before you joined the law department, because I had left for private practice before going into talent acquisition. And our baptism by fire was September 11th. My second day of work, the world exploded, and I could not have envisioned the fact that I would be working on declaratory judgment action for the lawsuit for family members of victims of Trade Center disaster to obtain death certificates where bodies hadn't been identified.
Mm-hmm.
Could not have prepared for that in law school. Nothing I did prepared me for that per se. The city of New York, for whom I worked at the time, was guided by 2 areas of law. One was emergency management, guided by Oklahoma City, because the folks in the dealing with the Morris building bombing had to react. And then in addition, we had maritime law for bodies lost at sea. And so you may not respond to a crisis or a potential crisis or a threat that's identical in nature, but having people with institutional knowledge and a certain calm in the face of crisis really helps. So I can see how that makes a difference.
Absolutely.
With that in mind, I'm curious, without spilling the tea any more than you're permitted, what do you see as some of the biggest external threats that governments and businesses should anticipate having to face in the coming years?
So I would definitely start with cyber there. I think that not to say that it's necessarily new, but I think that there is this sense that you need every organization, and I think that's true even for small ones, needs to have a cybersecurity program to deal with the threats that are out there. And I think one of the issues with the threats from cybersecurity is that the threat actors can have so many different profiles, and so you're going to want to be thinking about that. I guess I would also say I don't know if I would call this a threat, but I do spend a good deal of time, thinking about the intersection of the proliferation of work from home and workforces being apart, for better or for worse. I'm not making a normative judgment here.
The devices you might use, I was going to say, way that you dial into the network, whatever that may be. There's a lot of different areas where there's potential slippage.
Absolutely, there's a different flow of data. There are, pressing questions about the use of personal devices and networks for work, all of which, none would have the time to answer as the sort of pandemic hit us. But now it is what it is, and there's a sort of that issue of personal devices, personal networks. I think there's also the question of sort of how do cybersecurity teams keep the necessary bonds among themselves, in a remote setting. And I just want to be clear, I'm not making a normative judgment better or worse, meaning I'm not here to talk about whether work from home is better. I cannot opine on that. I'm just saying that it's here to stay in one way or the other. And that just means, and that could even be, shared workspaces on top of that. I mean, as we're here in
we're sitting recording in a WeWork.
In a WeWork, and of course, it made me think of it as we started today. Shared workspaces are great. It's a way to be efficient. There's a benefit from an environmental perspective, right? One building, different companies using it, but it just opens questions about network, about communications, about data flow. So again, I'm not calling that a threat per se, but I think that counsel in the cybersecurity world need to be thinking about it. And I know from the Tricarico Institute's perspective and the work I'm doing with students, many of whom have had a large portion of their entire legal training, done remote.
Are most of your students who've gone straight from a college setting to a law school setting without any work in between?
No, it varies, but many of our students had to be remote for a portion of their law school training, and that sort of would have introduced them to that. Unfortunately, now we're back and have been for a while back in person at the law school, which is fantastic. So yeah, I think that's something that's going to be big. And as a lawyer, you're just going to be thinking, well, what does it mean to practice law when I'm advising, business teams that are operating hybrid?
Sure. Now, another question that comes to mind as I hear you speaking about this, and you can keep it focused on, I was going to say, on the issues of cybersecurity that we've been discussing, or feel free to broaden out to the general practice of in-house counsel. Just developments that you're seeing and what you anticipate in the next 5 to 10 years. And to the extent that I know you're informed by that, having worn the hats of, it's like a 5-part question, I apologize, but you've worn the hats of counsel in government, somebody in private practice, now as an academic. Looking at it with that, do you see more opportunities for interplay between lawyers wearing those different hats? And what do you see that sort of meaning for the practice of law, particularly for in-house counsel, in the next 5 years?
I think the way I'd answer that, Valerie, is you're going to start with technology, right? So sort of the linchpin in my view is technology and the ways in which technology kind of inexorably advances. And so whatever that looks like, that is going to inform all of those touch points. Academia, obviously, what we do is we think about, we look into, what that means. let's say outside counsel's perspective, it's going to require outside firms to be prepared to handle, technology companies as their clients, and then also to utilize technology within the confines of their firm practice.
Or to deal with some clients whose technology may not be as current as one might hope.
Absolutely, and to assist them in multiple ways. In government, never gets to sleep, right? So it's like government's job is always going to be there, and if there are new technologies that come into play, the question is going to be, what does that look like? I know when I was at the city, we worked extensively on 5G, right? Trying to make the city, kind of a 5G mecca. We did some great work on that, and they continue to do some great work in the city on that. And actually, there was an article I was reading today in Cranes, New York, about it. That's an example where, what does speedier connection mean from a security perspective, from a productivity perspective? Again, like I spent some time just almost in awe. You and I go back a ways to a time where there, to a pre-smartphone era. I spent some time almost in awe of what these smartphones can do. These smartphones that are sitting in our pockets, and the amount of data they have, the amount of the extensive application footprint that they have, and
the computers you and I took off to our freshman year of college are just humbled by the little devices that sit in our
completely. And I think for me, that will be something to look at. To give one example, Bluetooth. Who's thinking about Bluetooth policy from a broad perspective in terms of is your Bluetooth on right now, and if it is, what's it connecting to, or what's it not connecting to, and who should think about it? I mean, it's a huge question for government, right? Back when I was there, and I'm sure people in government are thinking about that. Can you get hacked via Bluetooth? If so, what should you do about it? So those are some of the things I see coming down the pipe.
Right. So everything has potential to be more blessing than curse, but you have to think about the regulators have to figure out whether or how to regulate. The academics have to understand what it means. The folks in private practice have to guide their clients. There's just a lot to be done, and then in-house, you have to figure out whose advice to take and on what timeline.
Sure.
So much to do. With all this going on, I guess my real question is, you sort of stand at an interesting watershed moment where you're spearheading this amazing institute, giving advice to people who are coming up through the ranks. I guess my question is, looking at our readers, what's the top advice you would give to listeners today about career advancement in this area?
This is going to sound unrefined. The top advice I give, to my students and to people who work for me is to be consistently a good person in all that you do. I think that, of all the things we've talked about, to succeed, that believes it means actually taking care of your clients, taking care of the teams that work for you, taking care of the people you work for, and thinking about even as part of that, people you don't know. Right? So what I mean by that is, we all, I think, have an obligation to our fellow person. And my view of it is that if you're going to work, taking care of the people you work for, obviously trying to do good substantive work, but I think that's the true path to success. Now, do I think people who are not good succeed? Of course, there are plenty of those.
We've seen it, yes.
Plenty of those, and that's fine. That's just a different path. But you're asking me, and so I'm here to say to you and to the people listening, that's my top advice. I say to my students, get in your vocabulary, how can I help? Those words. How can I help you with this? And because we're lawyers, we're supposed to help. That's kind of the point, right? No one calls a lawyer because they don't need help. Right? No one has a lawyer out because they don't need help. They need help. They need, I have this new regulation came out and I don't understand it, or I just got a contract that's 70 pages long and it's, from this, opposing party. What does it say? What should it say? And you help them. So I think that to me, that's my number one tip.
No, I appreciate that. The reality is that we need to issue spot as lawyers, but the issues implicate facts, and the facts impact people's lives and livelihoods. And so if you remember that at its heart, anything you're doing is going to give people information to change their lives, potentially for the better, or the operation of their businesses potentially for the better, then you're doing great. And if we sort of try to wear that hat as lawyers coming up in the industry, And if you teach people to do that, you're doing wonderfully. So
And I wanted to add
thanks
to
for
that point. You know, we teach at New York Law School and others teach it as well. We're certainly focusing on it at the Tricarico Institute. Lawyers in-house, I think, have an obligation to keep their eye on the organization doing what is right beyond what is lawful. As I say, and I've said this recently at a program we had at the law school, sometimes if the lawyer doesn't do that, nobody will. And so, yeah, I think that in that regard, it's not just being good, but it's also just keeping your eye on, doing the right thing. And actually, this is something we focus on a lot at the Tricarico Institute, because in classic legal training, that maybe wouldn't have come up. You would have, taken a course in contracts, you'd have taken a course in constitutional law, and it would have been about the precedent and about how to apply the precedent and how the law evolves. And so in classic legal training, it maybe wouldn't have come up, are you doing the right thing? Whereas I think that, in-house lawyers absolutely need to be thinking about that. And I would add, ESG is another very important topic that has touch points with the legal tower. And that, of course, is all about doing the right thing and rectifying, prior embedded injustice. And so I think that lawyers have a big role and have a big opportunity. I think that an organization that has a successful ESG program likely will have a big supporter in the counsel's office as well to make it happen.
Yeah, there's a difference between being told, get me to yes, and should I get to yes, and what does it mean if I get to yes?
Yeah.
Those mandates are very different. And if you're educating and empowering the lawyers at your institute to think about those considerations, they and the businesses they serve and interact with them better for it. So I think it's just terrific. I'm so grateful to you for sharing these perspectives and being so generous with your time. Thank you so much for coming today, sharing a bit about your path, and thanks everyone for listening today. So grateful to you all.
Glad to do it. And if anyone reaches out to you wanting to chat more with me, I'm always available.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.